Hello. Yes, I'm back after, oh boy, it's almost been a year. Yeah, well, um, explain why I haven't posting videos for quite a while. It's pretty much just because I've been in school for that time, and school takes up a lot of focus sometimes. And that taken into account, also with the fact that these videos take a lot of time to both write, to edit, and then to upload. You know, but with that being said, I've got some stuff in the work like that I'm, planning on making, so that this is hopefully a return to video making and all that kind of stuff. And then here's the pitch for Patreon. Welcome back to my channel. Just before we start the video, I wanted to say that if you'd like to support any of the stuff that I do on this channel, you can support me at Patreon. Links will be in the description. I also have a PayPal. Also, links will be in the description. And if you'd like to contribute a little bit, I'd be very appreciative. Anyway, with that, let's continue. About the 6th day of February, 1920, an employee in the jail came and ordered me to carry out the pails from cells. I refused to do that, stating that I was a barber and was ready to work at my trade, and that I was ready to carry out my own pail, but that I did not intend to carry out pails for other prisoners. I was immediately taken down to the basement and brought into a dark room with no windows and no means of ventilation. As far as I could judge, the size of the room was approximately 8 feet by 4 feet. The floor was of cement and was very hot. Even the walls and the door were hot. I was placed in that room at 9 o'clock in the morning of February 6th, and remained there until 2 o'clock in the afternoon of February 8th, a total of 53 hours. The only food that I received while in the cell was 1 glass of water and a small piece of bread twice a day. I suffered intensely throughout the period of my confinement in that cell, being forced soon after I was placed therein to remove all of my clothing and to remain naked on account of the intense heat. Beginning with the second morning of my confinement, namely the morning of February 7th, I was too weak to stand up and remained in a reclining position until I was removed from the cell. My complaints were disregarded until the afternoon of February 8th, when my condition was such that I was unable to walk as much as 10 feet without stopping several times on account of weakness, dizziness, etc. My left arm and left leg felt paralyzed so that I had difficulty in using them, and the pain in my right leg was intense. I received medical treatment in the jail immediately after my release from the cell, and soon after my release from jail was forced to obtain medical treatment again. For the last 3 weeks I have been in the hospital with what I am informed is a form of rheumatism of the nerves, an ailment from which I have never suffered in my life before. I am confined to my bed at frequent intervals and still suffer great pain as a result of my treatment in the jail. I was forced to sell my barber shop with its entire equipment at a great loss, and am now without a place of business, without tools or the means of purchasing them, and in such bad health that I do not know when I shall be able to resume my work in any capacity at all. Statement of Anton Dimitrov, May 18th, 1920. How did we get here? Welcome to possibly the final chapter of my series on the first Red Scare and, more specifically, the raids carried out by the Justice Department against left-wing activists and immigrants. As for the quote I just read, it'll take a little while, surprise, for me to reveal where it came from, but I will explain it. Anyhow, where we begin is where we left off. Damn, I might quote that, jeez. The transition of the Overman Committee from German subversion to Bolshevik communism. Reds. The world had experienced a near complete alteration and would never go back to the way it had been. Let's put this into perspective. Almost 40 million people soldier and civilian on both sides, were either killed or wounded across Europe. At the end of the war, however, the Spanish flu, better known today as H1N1, something I got a vaccine for when I was 9, pandemic infected around 500 million people worldwide and killed between 50 and 100 million, aka 3 to 5% of the world's population, helping further reshape the world. 9 different peace treaties were signed between multiple countries over the next several years. 4 different empires, the Ottomans, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Russians, all collapsed as a result of the war. Countries that never existed, once existed, were carved out of other countries and created out of whole cloth, i.e. Poland, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Austria, Hungary, and Ireland. Sparked by the Russian Revolution and the massive upheaval caused by the war, revolutions, uprisings, and independence campaigns spread across the continent, most with socialist or communist tendencies. Additionally, the war offered the fuel for the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. All of that is either happening or being set up to happen at the same time that the Overman Committee officially began investigating Bolshevik subversion in America on February 11, 1919. Over the course of a month of interviews, 25 in all, the subcommittee, which was tasked originally with investigating communist subversion in America, pretty much ended up focusing on the conditions within Russia and the new Bolshevik regime. Regardless, it was the first Congressional committee to investigate communism, and it spent most of its time trying to trash the USSR. The vast majority of the witnesses brought forward were anti-Bolshevik, but several were actually pro-Bolshevik and defending the Russian right to self-determination. The most notable example was socialite feminist activist Louise Bryant, the wife of socialist journalist John Reed, who presented a directly antagonistic testimony against the committee chairman, conservative North Carolina Senator Lee Overman, immortalized by Diane Keaton in the Academy Award-winning 1981 film Reds. Most of the anti-Bolshevik witnesses were members of the post-revolution Russian diaspora, who also used to be government officials. The other themes of the committee investigations, beside the situation in Russia, broke into 3 things, all of which are incredibly idiotic and makes you realize conservative talking points are really outdated. 1. The anti-Americanism of American intelligentsia. 2. The connection of Jews and communists. 3. The made-up nationalization of women after the revolution. First, let's just acknowledge how dated the conservative line that colleges and universities, among the rest of American intellectuals, are all anti-American and want to spread communism to the masses. I mean, it's literally now 100 plus years old. Apparently, in a very Turning Point USA Professor Watchlist way, the prominent anti-radical attorney Archibald Stevenson, a major witness for the committee, compiled a list of 200 names that he later lessened to 62 of alleged communist professors. He also stated that colleges and universities were a breeding ground of sedition, atheism, and materialism. Oh yeah, you heard that second part right. Atheism. That was another big thing that, for a lack of a better word, triggered the committee so incredibly much that socialists and communists were against Christianity, an incomprehensible fact for some of the most powerful men in the American government. To illustrate this a bit better, I think some direct quotes may be in order. Of course, that book, or any teachings in that book, would not appeal to the Lets, or the Chinese coolies, or the German soldiers, or some who are controlling these Bolshevik movements. What I am trying to get at is, from my information, why Bolshevism is bitterly opposed to all sorts of religion or sacraments of the Church, Christianity. because I suppose they recognize that Christianity is the basis of law and order and of orderly government. I was wondering if you had discovered why they were so bitterly against Christianity, and if you found that all the Bolsheviks were atheistic, rationalistic, or anti-Christian. My experience over there under the Bolsheviki regime has led me to come to the conclusion that the Bolsheviki religion is not only absolutely anti-religious, atheistic, but has in its mind to make all real religious work impossible as soon as they can achieve that end which they are pressing. There was a meeting, I cannot give you the date offhand, it must have been in August 1918, held in a large hall that had once been used by the Young Men's Christian Association in Petrograd for their work among the Russian soldiers. The Bolsheviki confiscated it, put out the YMCA. In that large hall there was a meeting held, which was to be a sort of religious dispute. Luchencharsky, the Commissar of People's Enlightenment, as he was called, and Mr. Spitzberg, who was the Commissar of Propaganda for Bolshevism, were the two main speakers. Both of these men spoke in very much the same way as Emma Goldman has been speaking. I have been getting some of her literature, and recently I have been very much amazed at the same line of argumentation with regard to the attack on religion and Christianity and so-called religious organizations. I think I have to repeat again for the first quote, citation needed. Again, another conservative talking point revealed to be ancient and antiquated, that Judeo-Christian values are the foundation of American government. Well, Senator King would have only really included the Christian part in all honesty, which segues into the other stellar focus of the committee, the connection between Jews and the Bolsheviks. I really couldn't demonstrate the fairly blatant anti-Semitism these elected officials and experts engaged in through anything other than direct quotes. Quick warning, this will get somewhat Nazi-like. The leaders of the movement, I would say, are about 2/3 Russian Jews, and perhaps 1/6 or more of them of the other nationalities, like the Lets or the Armenians. The assistant in the Foreign Office was an Armenian. Then there are the Georgians, that is, the so-called Gruzinians of the Caucasus, and the remaining number Slavs. The superiority of the Jews is due to their intellectual superiority, because the average Jew is so much better educated than the average Russian. And also, I think, to the fact that the Hebrew people have suffered so in the past in Russia, that it has inevitably resulted in their cherishing a grudge which has been worked out by the movement. Tell us about the book. What is so bad about it? Is it anti-Christian? It is anti-Christian, and it shows what this secret Jewish society has been doing in order to make a conquest of the world, and to make the Christian forces as ineffective as possible, and finally to have the whole world, if you please, in their grip. And now, if the book ever so many things are said with regard to their program and their methods, which dovetail into the Bolshevik regime, it just looks as if that is connected in some way. Now, I have no animus against the Jews, but I have a great passion for the truth. If there's anything in it, I think we ought to know. Yeah, they said that. In a Congressional committee hearing. That Reverend Simons guy was so unnecessarily focused on the connection between Jews and the Bolshevik government that multiple Jewish advocacy groups came out against him, and Chairman Lee Overman had to clarify that Simons was talking about apostate Jews, you know, the ones who left the religion and not the good kind of Jews. Really makes you think about how the Nazis managed to slip under the radar for so long. Anyhow, what about that thing about women? Roll the quote reel. Do you know whether they teach free love? They do. Can a marriage be secured upon the application of one party to the marriage, or has it to be by agreement? I think by one party. By either party? By either party. They can renounce the marital bond at will. Precisely. I have seen the Russian and the translations of what purported to be decrees or orders of some of the so-called Soviets, in effect abolishing marriage and establishing what has been called free love. Do you know anything about that? Their program you will find in the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels. Since we left Petrograd, they have, if the newspaper reports are to be relied upon, already instituted a very definite program with regard to the so-called socialization of women, each woman from 18 to 46 being obliged to appear before the commissariat and be given, nolens volens, a man with whom she shall live. They are aiming toward free love. They are doing away with the marriage ceremony, and they have, of course, adopted a civil ceremony. And in some places, they have it for a term of years. So, to summarize the things this committee, which, if you'd forgotten like I almost did, was about counter-subversion, chose to focus on was that the Christian United States needs to be fearful of the atheistic Bolsheviks, how the Jews were trying to use Bolshevism to destroy Christianity, but just the bad ones, and that women in the USSR were being treated as state property, when in reality the Bolsheviks initially did away with ancient czarist policies banning homosexuality and making it near impossible for women to obtain a divorce at all or just remain single. In fact, the Bolsheviks very much promoted women's rights. Alexandra Kollontai, a Marxist feminist, was one of Lenin's top and most prominent collaborators during and after the revolution, and in the subsequent Bolshevik government. She held a powerful position from which she fought female literacy and advocated properly educating women on new laws. At any rate, the Overman Committee's main function was to demonize the Soviet Union, but more importantly, to spread fear around the possibility that the same thing could happen in the United States. Okay. So we've gone over the committee's frantic and idiotic work on Bolshevism, which I must point out features a lot of conservative arguments that are still being used today. Let's leave the committee behind for a little while, since nothing huge involving it happened in the months leading up to the release of its final report during the Red Summer, which I've covered in Part 1. Now, we move on to June of 1919. 1 month after the Galleanists launched their May Day bombing campaigns, aka the first string of bombings. Yeah, there was a second one. This time, the bombs they used were much bigger, using 25 pounds of dynamite in each bomb wrapped in heavy metal slugs to act as shrapnel, and each was being hand-delivered by a Galleanist to the target's address. They weren't messing around this time. Too bad they literally blew themselves up in the end. There were only 9 targets this time, as opposed to almost 40, like the first time, and were all concentrated on the East Coast, with only one particularly high-profile subject. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer for the second time. Palmer's Firestorm. So, on June 2nd, 1919, at Palmer's Washington, D.C. home, a bomb prematurely detonated, killing the Galleanist Carlo Valdinocci, a former editor of the Galleanist Cronaca Sovietica, an associate of Galliani himself, and was literally blown into multiple pieces. While none in the Palmer household were injured seriously, the family was shaken by the blast and most of their home was demolished. An interesting what-if of history also appeared due to the 2 other near casualties of the blast. Palmer's across-the-street neighbor, the lowly Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and his wife, aka Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. They had been walking by the house mere minutes before the bomb went off, and their home was close enough to it that, content warning, a body part of the exploded Veldenoci landed on their doorstep. This was, as you'll probably realize, the second failed attempt on Palmer's life by the Galleonists, and almost immediately after this bombing, which came pretty damn close to actually killing him, Palmer went directly to the House Appropriations Committee and requested an increase of $2 million from $1.5 million to his department to increase investigations into radicals, although he ended up only getting $100,000. However, this was not the only reason that Palmer did this, because let's not forget how crazy a year 1919 was. Race riots weren't the only kind of unrest that occurred, by which I mean there were an estimated 3,500 labor strikes in America in just 1919, a number which had been climbing for years before. This was the year that the Boston Police Department would go on strike in September when talks about forming a union broke down with the commissioner. The people who are called to break up strikes most often went on strike. This was only one of the thousands of strikes, but it was one of the most high profile, and of course only helped fuel the rising anti-labor and anti-red sentiments. I could maybe have written more on this whole factor, but it kind of explains itself. Alright, finally, we can actually start to get into the actual Palmer raids, though I will be adding in needed details here and there. A good place to start explaining the Overman Committee's report, released about a fortnight after the bombing of Palmer's home. The report. As you'll probably know already, the committee took interviews and such early in the year, went kinda silent for the next couple of months while they quote-unquote deliberated over what they'd gathered. Then, finally, the committee released its 35,000-word report of June 15th, 1919, short enough that the New York Times printed a copy of the entire report on about 4 pages. So, what did this sensational report say? Well, roll the quote reel. The salient features which constitute the program of Bolshevism as it exists today in Russia, and it's presented to the rest of the world as a panacea for all ills, may be summarized as follows, edited down for time. The monopolizing by the state of all advertisements of every nature, whether newspapers, periodicals, handbills, or programs. The abolition of Sunday school and all other schools and institutions that teach religion. The absolute separation of churches and schools. The establishment, through marriage and divorce laws, of a method for the legalization of prostitution, when the same is engaged in by consent of the parties. The refusal to recognize the existence of God in its governmental and judicial proceedings. The conferring of the rights of citizenship on aliens without regard to length of residence or intelligence. I'm really resisting the urge to say cry me a river right now, because the report is filled with highly emotional and moralistic rhetoric about how superior the American system is, and how, if we ever let socialism into the country, then it pretty much would be the equivalent of letting Satan into the Garden of Eden. It is the most grandiose propaganda you can find, and I mean propaganda in the strictest sense of the word, because despite all of its rhetoric, the report provided almost no evidence of Bolshevik propaganda or subversion in the United States. Unfortunately, what it did provide were suggestions to suppress any radical dissent, which included deporting radicals, peacetime sedition laws, regulations on explosive manufacturing, distribution, and possession, regulation/control of non-English publications, and the creation of patriotic American propaganda. Well, as you might be able to figure out, the press not only ran with this propagandistic report, but Palmer, the Justice Department, and a number of other government officials started taking action. Before rolling right into that, after the conclusion of the committee's work, New York State thought, hey, what if we did, the same exact thing? which is exactly what they did, forming the Anti-Radical Lusk Committee, and it was in operation until January of 1920. Just wanted to put that in to cover my bases down the road. Don't worry, I'll come back to it. Anyway, let's get into the raids. The beginning. In July of 1919, the first designated anti-radical raid was carried out in Buffalo, New York. Agents of the Justice Department arrested 3 people who were believed to be publishing socialistic material against the government. However, this was a bust, since the judge they brought the case to threw it out since the publications were advocating for government transformation not by violence, but by utilizing their right to free speech. Because obviously that's legal in America. Not only that, but the legal authority over deportation of aliens lay not with Palmer and the Justice Department, but with the Labor Department, which seems a little odd to me, honestly, even though I'm glad in this instance that they were. I imagine it's mostly because immigrants are expected to become the mechanism for the further expansion of capitalism, but I can't be certain. As it turns out, under the 1918 Immigration Act, the Secretary of Labor had the power to issue arrest warrants for aliens, violent or not, and sign deportation orders after an assessment by the immigration inspector. This, of course, taught Palmer that if he was going to find success in this crusade, he'd need to make an alliance with Labor Secretary William B. Wilson. It was an uneasy one, since Wilson's loyalties and decisions fell more often with Labor, the IWW, and aliens. Additionally, while Palmer and the Justice Department wanted to just de facto deport people for their mere membership in the IWW, Secretary Wilson believed no single member of an organization can be held responsible for the lawless actions of other members unless there's proof of actual participation or knowledge of it, or unless those lawless practices are authorized officially in the organization's organic documents. Wilson himself concluded the IWW was a legitimate labor organization. So for Palmer and his cronies, we're off to a rough start. However, while they couldn't get all of them in one go, they could still go after as many as possible by any means necessary. Fast forwarding a bit, around late July, the Justice Department created a new division of the Bureau of Investigations called the General Intelligence Division, GID. And on August 1st, 1919, Attorney General Palmer appointed its chief, a 24-year-old law school graduate and Justice Department clerk that you may have heard of, who knows, maybe not, named J. Edgar Hoover. For anyone who unironically doesn't know who he is, first, how? Second, he would go on to become the founding director of the FBI and would wreak havoc on this country's civil liberties, activists, and citizens in general for almost 5 decades. This was young J. Edgar Hoover's first big-time job in the government or national affairs, and it seems that it would be a defining experience for the rest of his career. As his boss quickly became preoccupied with all the labor strikes, Hoover immediately got to work in his new powerful role, hiring a team of translators and readers to monitor over 400 domestic and foreign publications, as well as delving deep into radical literature from Marx to Trotsky. The time Congress called upon Palmer to testify on the progress of the anti-radical campaign on October 17th, he reported, using numbers from Hoover, that they had amassed a card catalog of over 60,000 radical-inclined individuals, publications, and organizations, and thus advocated for new sedition laws to expand his authority. Now, that may sound impressive and rather frightening, but it didn't automatically make it legal to deport U.S. radical citizens for no crime other than being a radical, which is the kind of thing Palmer and Hoover were most certainly aiming for. Think of it like the pre-crime program from Minority Report, but the really, really analog version. What they could legally go after, they realized, were alien radicals through the Labor Department's authority in this area. More so than anything else, however, what Palmer and Hoover succeeded in was relentlessly pushing the notion that radicals in America posed an imminent threat to the government, which not only made the populace complacent and often supportive of the Justice Department's actions. Now, finally, why not we get into the first major raids and how fascistic, honestly, they really were. Bloody, Bloody Friday. At 9 p.m. on Friday, November 7th, 1919, the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, agents of the Investigation Bureau, aided by local police, launched raids on radical/suspected radical headquarters in 11 major cities, those being Detroit, Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Buffalo, Hartford, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, a non-specific West Virginia city, and New York City. The raids in New York City are most notable, particularly on a building known as the Russian People's House, a 4-story brownstone at number 133 East 15th Street, and so called as it was the headquarters of the anarchist Union Russian Workers. And at the time of the raid, several educational classes were in session, teaching students English, Russian, and arithmetic. None had any idea something was wrong when Justice Department agents barged into the classroom and began beating the hell out of everyone for seemingly no reason. In one classroom, Mitchell Lavrovsky, a 50-year-old Russian immigrant who was teaching algebra before an agent burst in with a gun, was ordered to step forward and take off his glasses. The agent bashed Lavrovsky in the face with his elbow, followed by 2 other agents brutally beating him and throwing him down the stairs, finished off by 2 other officers beating him further with pieces of wood broken off from the banister. In another classroom, Nikolai Melikov was struck on the head by an agent before being knocked down and getting a knee in the back until blood was coming out of Melikov's mouth. Don't worry though, he had to wash his face off before getting thrown down the stairs too, as was everyone else. Not an exaggeration. All of them were beaten and specifically thrown down the stairs. Many suffered fractured heads and limbs from these savage beatings, to the point that even newspapers like the New York Times, who were sympathetic to the government's cause, couldn't help but report on the multitude of arrestees who had their heads wrapped in bandages. These were some of the noted examples of the arrests carried out with warrants from the Labor Department, though suspiciously more arrests than the amount of warrants issued. In NYC, 27 warrants were issued, but 200 ended up getting arrested. And in Newark, 36 warrants were issued, but 150 arrests were made. Those taken prisoner by the agents were taken to the Justice Department offices at 13 Park Row for bandaging up and interrogation, while other agents needlessly ransacked the offices and classrooms back at the People's House so that it looked as though a bomb had gone off. If suspects had sufficient evidence against them for deportation, as most were aliens, they were shipped off to Ellis Island. In all, over 1,000 aliens were arrested, the vast majority without a warrant. Hoover and Palmer, now riding a wave of congratulatory press calling them national heroes, thanks in large part to Hoover providing newspapers with personal reports of the operations, immediately started planning another raid. This one against the Communist and Communist Labor parties. In the meantime, Hoover convinced Secretary Wilson somehow to change the ground rules regarding detained aliens' right to counsel. As a result of that, progressive union lawyers put together a pamphlet called Our Constitutional Rights, Notice to Aliens, advising detained aliens to remain silent and consult a lawyer before answering questions, as the Constitution provides them. Hoover, the bastion of compassion that he was, responded by amending the immigration regulations to delay the right to a lawyer until the case had, quote, proceeded sufficiently in the development of the facts to protect the government's interests. Additionally, Hoover urged immigration authorities to set ridiculously high bail amounts to make release impossible, which, combined with the rule changes on right to counsel, basically ensured that the detained aliens would get deported, or whatever other punishments may be brought down. Anybody out there think this sounds just, I don't know, a little very illegal? Because it sure is. But pesky things like ethics and legality never stopped J. Edgar Hoover, as anyone familiar with the history of the FBI will attest to. Which transitions us into what the Justice Department did with many of those they arrested just short of 2 months later. The Soviet Ark. Let me set the scene, and try to imagine yourself as an onlooker. It was December 21st, 1919, a Sunday, at 6 a.m. at New York Harbor, Ellis Island. The temperature is barely 1 degree Fahrenheit, -18 Celsius just about, with the city having just seen the coldest day of the year. A decommissioned U.S. Navy cargo/passenger ship is stationed and preparing for departure with 249 passengers, not including crew members. The ship, when first commissioned by the Belfast company Harland and Wolff in 1890, was named the SS Mississippi, being used as an American transport ship that strangely flew British colors, crossing the Atlantic back and forth until 1898, when the U.S. Army purchased her as an Army transport ship for the Caribbean theater of the Spanish-American War. It was in this position that the Mississippi gained her more well-known name, the USS Buford, after the Union cavalry officer and hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, John T. Buford. Over the next 20 years, the Buford saw extensive service in the United States' conflicts in the Pacific, from the Philippines and San Francisco to Hawaii and China. Her last official missions were transporting U.S. soldiers back home during World War I and crossing the Panama Canal Zone before being officially decommissioned. However, it was in her, quote, retirement, I suppose is the term, that the Buford saw her most famous incarnation as the so-called Soviet Ark. The passengers on that day were made up mostly of the members from the Union of Russian Workers, around 199 of the 249, even though the only crimes many of them had committed were having their name appear on a membership paper. However, the most high-profile deportees of all were the firebrand anarchist activists, writers, and partners, Emma Goldman and Alexander Bergman. Goldman had first come to America from her native Russia, now present-day Lithuania, in the 1880s, and had from that point on raised hell in both her activism and her advocacy of numerous issues. Among other things, she opposed first-wave feminism due to what she believed were its limited goals, take the rather prescient phrase, as if women have not sold their votes, as if women politicians cannot be bought, and fiercely advocated for the rights of women through her own brand of anarcho-feminism, more in line with third-wave feminism, in fact. Advocated for educating women on contraception, as she was a nurse by training, which led to her being arrested on multiple occasions. This was a very messed up era. Along with her advocacy of free love, which separates the state from any matters of sexuality. And was the first and only woman, and first and only American, according to Magnus Hirschfeld, the famous German physician who coined the term transsexual, to defend the rights of queer folks to love who they wanted, and advocated extensively for the social liberation of lesbians and gay men. In the 1900s and 1910s, like any good revolutionary, she was surveilled, arrested, harassed, and imprisoned on multiple occasions for her advocacy. But with the advent of the Red Scare, the government used the raids as its opportunity to get rid of a long-time annoyance of theirs. Despite having lived in America since she was 15, almost 40 years prior, Goldman was being sent away with her partner to Soviet Russia with the other so-called desirables, never to set foot in the United States again. The trip was about a month long, and according to Goldman's recollection of the ship's conditions, for 28 days we were prisoners. Sentries at our cabin doors day and night. Sentries on deck during the hour we were daily permitted to breathe the fresh air. Our men, comrades, were cooped up in dark, damp quarters, wretchedly fed, all of us, in complete ignorance of the direction we were to take. The initial destination of Latvia was dropped due to difficulty in the State Department planning a landing, and was switched to the far more dangerous Finland, which was in the midst of a civil war. And so, on January 16, 1920, a Friday, at 4:25 p.m., the Soviet Ark reached Hanko, Finland, and officially landed on the next day at 2 p.m., from which point all the passengers were loaded onto transport cars manned by anti-communist Finnish White Guards and taken to Terjoki, 2 miles from the Finnish Bolshevik border. Once there, the deportees trudged through a heavy Balkan snowstorm after getting sidetracked for 2 days, and a parley was reached through white flags of truce between Goldman's partner Berkman, guarded by the Finns, and the Bolsheviks, on the frozen ice of the Sisterbach River, which separated the Finnish and Bolshevik lines. Berkman and Goldman waited until everyone else had safely crossed before joining them, all while the Russian national anthem was played by an army band. From the war-torn town of Bielo-Ostrov, the deportees finally made their way, by train, to Petrograd. All of this was Hoover's doing, as Attorney General Palmer was busy dealing with a nationwide coal strike in November and December. It should be noted that the vast majority of those on the Buford were there not because they had bombed an official's home, shot anyone, stolen anything, or done anything other than have their name appear on a left-wing organization's member log. Something which Labor Secretary William B. Wilson, the man in charge of issuing the warrants for these people, was pretty clear about that membership in an organization alone was not enough to require a warrant. So, how did Hoover just go around this? Well, he worked with more compliant labor officials and overwhelmed staff at the department to get the warrants he wanted. Because of course he did. Hoover succeeded in getting what he wanted when, on Christmas Eve, 1919, the Labor Department, having reviewed his requests for almost 3,000 warrants for both members of the Communist and Communist Labor parties, and his arguments for classifying them under the Anti-Radical 1918 Immigration Act, approved Hoover's warrants, all 2,768 of them. But to sum it up, the voyage of the Buford was not the end of the saga. If anything, it was the beginning.